One phone call to my aunt uncovered my father's buried secret. Now I know why he always said his life ended before I was born. I grew up in an abusive household, where the dynamics between my sister Sarah and me couldn't have been more different. From the moment I could form memories, I knew that my parents, Robert and Marie, saw me differently. Sarah got new clothes every season, had her own room with pink walls and a canopy bed, while I slept in what was essentially a converted closet with a threadbare mattress on the floor. My clothes were always hand-me-downs, usually from cousins we barely knew, and they never quite fit right. Every single bad thing that happened in that house was automatically my fault in my parents' eyes. If a glass broke in the kitchen while Sarah was alone there, somehow it was because I had created negative energy in the house. If the car wouldn't start in the morning, my father would turn to me with disgust and say, "Your existence brings bad luck to this family." My father, Robert, would constantly tell me out of the blue how much happier he'd be if he didn't have kids, though we both knew he meant just me. He'd be watching TV, and suddenly turn to me and say, "You know, Lisa, I could have been someone. I could have had a real life. Instead, I'm stuck here, and it's all because of you." He'd tell me I made his life miserable, that I was a literal demon and not human. Sometimes, he'd describe in vivid detail all the ways he wanted to physically hurt me, as if he was savoring each word. That's not even the half of it. The physical abuse wasn't as common as the emotional torture, but when it happened, it was severe. He'd beat me to the point I couldn't walk properly, leaving bruises in places my school uniform would hide. I remember one time, when I was 12, I got an A instead of an A on a math test. He used his belt that day, and I had to tell my gym teacher I had the flu so I wouldn't have to change in front of the other girls. My mother, Marie, was a special kind of cruel in her silence. She'd just watch, pretending like nothing happened. She'd cook dinner as I lay crying on the floor, humming hymns from church as if the sound could drown out my sobs. The next morning, she'd wake me up for school with a smile, asking what I wanted for breakfast as if the previous night had been a bad dream. I remember this one Christmas when I was 10. Sarah got a beautiful new bike, shiny and red with streamers on the handlebars. My present was a used math workbook because, as my father said, you need to work harder if you want to be worth anything in this family. I spent that Christmas day doing algebra while Sarah rode her bike outside, my mother taking pictures and my father beaming with pride. The neighbors must have known something was wrong. Mrs. Johnson next door would always give me extra cookies when I'd help her with her gardening, her eyes full of pity. Mr. Peterson across the street once tried to talk to my father about how he treated me, but that only made things worse at home. After that, I wasn't allowed to be outside without Sarah, my father claiming he couldn't trust me not to spread lies about our family. Anyway, a few months ago, at 29, I was feeling particularly lost in my life. The childhood trauma had left me with a collection of mental health issues that felt like a heavy backpack I could never take off. I was working a dead-end job at a local bookstore, living in a tiny apartment with walls so thin I could hear my neighbors breathe. I didn't know what to do with myself. That's when I decided to call my Aunt Carol, my father's sister who has lived in Australia for almost 30 years now. I hadn't spoken to her in years. My father had always controlled family communications, but I found her number through some old papers I kept from when I was a teenager. I asked her how she managed to move abroad, thinking maybe I could follow in her footsteps, escape like she did. Her response changed everything. She said, in her words, "I didn't plan it, the plane tickets didn't belong to me. They were your father's tickets, but you should ask him why he didn't go, it's a funny story." My heart dropped immediately. It's like a lifetime of mystery suddenly made sense, like someone had finally given me the key to a door I'd been banging against for decades. My Aunt Carol has lived overseas for almost the same amount of time I've been alive, 29 years. My father had always talked about his dream to live abroad, how he'd planned to start a business in Australia, how different his life could have been. I started doing the math in my head. My mother was super religious at the time, so an abortion would have been out of the question for her. The timing lined up perfectly. I was conceived out of wedlock, and my father hasn't been able to move because of me. His dreams of Australia died the day my mother told him she was pregnant. My parents were always suspiciously adamant that I wasn't a mistake. Completely out of the blue, they would say how I was an intentional choice, definitely not a mistake on their part. Meanwhile, extended family would always look at me differently than they did Sarah. Aunt Jenny would always hesitate before saying I looked like my father. Uncle Tom would make odd comments about how surprising it was that I was so good at math, given my background. Literally everything makes sense now. Why my parents were never really affectionate with each other, their marriage was a shotgun wedding, not a love match. Why when I was 8 years old and asked my mother how my father proposed, she said it was an agreement, because it was, an agreement to avoid scandal. The way my father would call me a mistake all the time in primary school, how he'd look at me with such resentment when he thought I couldn't see. Why he always blamed every single wrong thing that happened to him on me, because in his mind, I was the embodiment of his ruined dreams. I remember this one time when I was 14, I found an old photo album in the attic. There was a picture of my father standing in front of a travel agency, holding a brochure for Australia. He looked so young, so full of hope. When he caught me looking at it, he ripped the photo out of the album and burned it in the backyard, telling me to never go through his things again. Even the way they treated Sarah makes more sense now. She was the planned child, the one they had when they were ready, when they had accepted their life here. She was born 3 years after me, and it was like watching two different families. Sarah got birthday parties with themes and cakes shaped like castles. My birthdays were acknowledged with a grunt and maybe, if I was lucky, a new notebook for school. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. My whole life, from as long as I can remember, I believed that I was literally subhuman. I thought that there was something bad or wrong about me fundamentally, like I was born broken, or a mistake or something. I'd work extra hard at school and always had the highest grades, thinking maybe if I was perfect enough, they'd finally love me. I tried hard to always be polite, always be respectful, never talk out of turn, didn't do drugs, etc. I tried so damn hard to be someone worth loving and I always failed. I remember in high school, I won a national essay competition. The prize was a $500 scholarship and my picture in the local paper. My father's only comment was, "I hope you don't think this makes up for ruining my life." My mother hung the article on the fridge, but only after Sarah had won a participation ribbon in her school's science fair. My achievement couldn't stand alone. Thinking back on my mental health problems now is crazy. I struggle with personal hygiene and cleanliness, and overly clean spaces scare me. I realize that comes from the neglect. When I was little, being clean meant being visible, and being visible meant being a target. I still only have one pair of shoes from 3 years ago because deep down I don't think I deserve nice things. They're falling apart, the sole's worn thin, but every time I think about buying new ones, I hear my father's voice telling me I don't deserve them. I haven't had new clothes in probably 15 years because of this mindset I've been trained to have. My wardrobe consists entirely of things I've had since high school or items from thrift stores that I've convinced myself are good enough for someone like me. I bought one jacket yesterday and instantly started dissociating at the mall. The saleswoman was so kind, helping me find the right size, and I nearly broke down crying when she said I looked nice in it. Doing anything at all that relates to taking care of myself fills me with anxiety. Sometimes I wonder about the parallel universe where my father got on that plane to Australia. Would he have been happy there? Would he have met someone else, had different children he could love without resentment? Would my mother have found someone who could match her religious devotion, someone who wouldn't view faith as a chain holding him back? Would Sarah exist in that universe? And what about me? Would I have been born to different parents, ones who saw me as a blessing rather than a burden? But mostly, I think about that little girl I used to be. The one who would hide in her closet bedroom, reading books by flashlight because stories were the only escape she had. The one who believed with all her heart that if she could just be good enough, quiet enough, smart enough, her parents would finally love her. I wish I could go back and tell her that it was never her fault. That she was a perfectly normal little girl who deserved so much better than what she got. That the dreams her father lost weren't more valuable than the life she was given. Maybe someday I'll find the strength to confront my parents about what I know. Maybe I'll finally ask my father if that ticket to Australia still haunts his dreams the way his words have haunted mine. But for now, I'm trying to learn how to live with this new understanding of my past, trying to unlearn the lesson that my existence is a mistake. It's not easy, and some days are harder than others, but I'm trying. And maybe that's enough for now. After all, I may have been an unplanned detour on my father's journey, but that doesn't mean my own journey has to stay derailed forever.